So I hope you guys don't mind. I'm gonna do this like Phil Donahue style. Does everyone remember who he is? Actually, so I like to walk around when I talk. So I appreciate you guys being flexible. And I just wanted to thank Shelly and Raj and Decode for choosing LA for the launch of this really important initiative. And I think the mayor hit. Actually, I feel like I should probably not do my presentation because the mayor hit all the points that I wanted to make anyway. But and I also want to apologize because you're going to see a couple slides that you've already seen already, and then number two, I'm actually not going to talk that much about technology, and you're gonna hear a little bit of why I'm going to do that. So just a little bit more about me in case you don't know. I just arrived 3 months ago from New York City, but I'm actually originally from LA. I grew up here, went to elementary school through high school here. It's been about 20 years that I've been outside of LA, and then I just got back, and it's amazing because it looks nothing like what I left, and it is the place to be right now, so I'm glad I'm here. For the past 15 years, I've been working for the city of New York in various capacities, all around public contracting. And most recently, I was Mayor de Blasio's Chief Procurement Officer, responsible for all of those departments that you heard about, and $21 billion, about $21 billion a year. And one thing I can say is that this is what public procurement feels like in New York, in LA, I'm sure in Santa Clara, I'm sure in, the federal government. This is what it feels like. I mean, I don't know if anyone agrees. I'm seeing some nodding heads. And part of it, I think everyone looks at this and says, this is bad and we got to do something. But I actually want to talk a little bit about why this exists, right? This did not, I mean, it probably did come about by accident to some degree, but it came about because of things that happened, right? And when you're thinking about public procurement, you're also thinking about public money. And so what's the most, what do you want to do with public money? You want to protect it. You want to be as risk averse as possible. And in New York, I will tell you, and I'm sure we have some stories in LA, in New York, there are actual stories about people exchanging money, bags of money, cash, in restrooms of restaurants in order to get contracts. Right? I mean, there's that history that exists. And so when you have that kind of history or a scandal about a contract that was not successful, that showed up in the front page of the LA Times or what newspaper, New York Times, USA Today, right? I don't actually read USA Today, but the press risk in government is real. And I think the governor touched on this a little bit too, is, and if you want to reform it, especially because there's money involved, everyone's going to accuse you of trying to reform it to your own benefit. And so there's all this inherent political press operational risk, and that's why I think this exists, right? All these icons actually mean something, right? All the pieces of paper, the approvals that you have, within your own departments. You probably, if you're like me, I remember having to, when I was a staff attorney, having to deal with 3 levels of legal review before I was able to give the contract to my client, who then needed 3 levels of program review in order to be able to get that to the city's law department or the city attorney in order to be able to get that approved. And then you finally get it signed, and then you have to get that approved by someone else. I mean, all of those approvals and oversights, they're there for a reason. They're there because something happened. And I think in government, we're really good at creating new things to do to react to something that happened, right? But we're not really good at looking back at it and saying, well, are we actually achieving the purpose for which we put this new requirement in place? And that's why an old boss of mine actually said that a flawed procurement process is the biggest inhibitor of the way that we do business. And when you think about that, it's not just the inside operational objectives. I do believe that procurement is so essential because it's an enabler of the actual delivery of services to our residents. And when you think about sort of the system as a whole, you also have to think about, all right, who's in the system? Who's my client? As a chief procurement officer, I am responsible. We all here, I think I see a lot of LA procurement folks here. we're all owners of this system. And so who are the clients? So for me, ultimately my clients are the taxpayers, but in sort of the immediate sense, my clients are my city departments, but also the vendor community. And I don't think we always think of the vendor community as clients. Ty showed you this before, right? This is my favorite slide, actually, from New York. And this is an actual piece. And this package of documentation of disclosures actually came about because of that bathroom, story that I told you about. Now it sounds bad, but the bag of money being exchanged story, right? Like this was our reaction to that. You have to disclose more and more information, because we in government, when we have a problem, we fix it with a form, right? That is what we're going to do. And when there's and in the old days, you had to fix it with a paper form, and you also had to get it notarized, right? And you had to get like 17 copies, because no one wants to make copies in the office. I mean, right? I mean, I remember my first department that I worked at, we used to require RFPs, 5 hard copies, plus a USB drive. I think the USB drive came later. And one day I was like, why are we asking for 5 copies? And someone said, so we don't have to make the copies, right? I mean, and so, when you think about those things, you think about, okay, well then who has to make it? Who's doing that work? This is what it looks like in LA. This is why I came, actually. It's less poundage. But it's very similar. We have the same problems, right? And Ty showed you, this is what it looks like in New York now. But this is not just representative of sort of the technology, right? Because in order for it to look like this, we actually had to ask the question, what are we doing? What is the purpose for these forms? What's the information that we're collecting, and how should that be collected? When we learned that we were asking for the same information over and over again, and it didn't matter if you were a small business, it didn't matter if you were a nonprofit actually in New York, it didn't matter if you were a one-person business or a multinational 500,000 person business, we asked for that package over and over and over again. And so we said, all right, how much of this information can actually be entered in once and just updated in a sort of in what we do with our banks, right? Like, what do you do at home? Like, how much of this can be completely rethought so that we're not saying this is a transaction, this information is transaction-based, but this information is yours and you're sharing it with us, and we want to be able to see it and share it across the government. And if you don't ask those questions, then this doesn't actually happen, right? What you're going to get is the same workflow, the same forms that just are on the screen. And that doesn't actually save you time. It doesn't save you work. It doesn't actually get, we could have done it the way that it was done on paper, which is I had a team of people 20 data entry specialists who worked 20 years just entering that data in just for accuracy. And it would take 30 to 40 days on average, not counting the outliers because we were cheating, right? And that would, what ended up happening afterwards is that someone would also then have to call to find out the information sometimes, because it's not easily shared. So what we said was, you know what, we have to rethink this. We have to think about what we're doing. What's the purpose of what we're doing? And I think everywhere you go, every time we have this procurement, when you're thinking about the whole process, when you're not just when you're thinking about source to pay, vendor management, performance management, procure to pay, whatever it is, the marketplace, the notices, yeah, I think you have to think about that. Because if we just decide if we think that putting it online, and no offense to all the technologists out there or the companies that do this work, but if we just digitize the process as it is now, you're actually not going to save anybody any time, and you're not going to make it better. And that's not what the public is looking for. That's not what you're looking for. And so I just want to counsel against thinking about it as sort of a silver bullet. So what are we going to do in LA? Well, we're going to like I said, I'm not talking about technology as much, right? What we're looking at is this whole life cycle of procurement, all of the work that you have to do, and we're going to look at it in detail. We're going to look at it not just from your perspective, but from your clients, the end users, but also from the vendor perspective, and see whether there's a way to rethink the way that we engage with each other and we have the process work. So we want to make things simpler. I talk to a lot of folks about minority and women-owned businesses and how we get smaller businesses to participate. And if you talk to them, I would think, and I don't know if anyone wants to say anything, the biggest inhibitor of competition is our complex process, right? I mean, you heard from the panel earlier, some people don't even know where to get started. Like, how is that possible, right? And you think, well, there's Google, you can just Google it. Well, if you have to Google something like that, how many results are going to come up? Like, that's not, you don't want people in this day and age to have 13 clicks or have to visit 18 websites before they get to the right one to find you. So we have to simplify the process. And I think even internally, we have to think about, at our department, how many approvals do we have? Why do we need all those approvals? How many pages is an RFP? And I know the city attorney's here, but like how many pages is our contract? Or how many of those provisions are locked? And how many of these can we share ahead of time? Or how can we actually redesign the RFP to say, these are all the legal things that, yes, you should have your lawyer look at or you should read, but that's separate, very separate from the scope. And the scope could be like 10 pages, right? Or maybe it could be 5 pages. Or what if we said, or 1 page? What if we said the scope not only has the actual requirements of what we're looking for, but what if that scope had each section outlined and like with a point value for each of the requirements that we want or the problems that we want solved, so that the vendor community knows exactly how much time to spend in each section, so that we're not getting these, look, I've done some anecdotal analysis, and I know that the vendor community, some people spend up to $150,000 on a proposal, and it looks beautiful. But I've actually read and evaluated. I cannot say that didn't affect my evaluation. So are we truly leveling the playing field if we allow that to happen? And those are things that, everything that I just listed right now, you do not need to change the law to do. You just need to have the will to do it, right? Because it is a risk, because it's a different way of doing business. But that's not something that we have to change the law to do. So I think we could do that very quickly. We talk about value, we talk about cost savings. When I'm thinking about value, I don't think just about money. Because public procurement, I think, it started with we just needed the essentials, right? Actually, the 2 things that people complain about most in procurement, I feel like, is chairs and pens. Like, we can never buy the right chairs and we can never buy the right pens. I don't know why, but those are things that people complain about all the time. But like nowadays, we're not just buying pens and chairs. We're not buying stuff for the stuff that you do. We're actually buying services, very complicated services that enable the work that gets done on the field. And so when we think about that, it's also, we're spending a lot more money doing that. And that money is an investment. It's not just spending, right? We have to think about it as an investment in our community, in our local economy, if possible, speaking of laws. And the way that we design around that is going to be key. So, Keith talked about getting rid of that 2-year requirement so that we get more startups in there, right? Mariel's going to talk about the Startup in Residence program. Well, what if the city decided, we don't need to change the law, but we could just have we could have backdrop contracts with some companies at various revenue streams, and then have them on contract so that we can actually say, hey, once they go through this existing long contracting cycle, hey, we have a problem. Would you like to help us solve it? It's going to be a small contract, but let's do a proof of concept. And so you can really just start interacting with these emerging companies. What if we said on a smaller construction contract, you don't need that level of bonding. You don't need that level of experience because we want to take a chance on you, right? That also maximizes value. And that also increases access. Because when you think about who's doing business with us, I know everyone here complains about, not having enough companies, right? Every government agency that I've been at, we always complain about it. And part of it is complexity. Part of it is that some businesses, it just costs too much to do business with us. But part of it is also access. When we have a complex system, when things are opaque, even as much as we try to be transparent about it, it does not actually allow new participants to come in easily, right? And so when we also talk about this, we're talking specifically, I think, about small, local, women, minority-owned businesses. But guess what we do to those businesses? We give them more stuff to fill out because we want them to prove that they're those businesses. And so for the businesses that we purport to want to do business with, we make it harder. And so we have to think about, okay, well, if we're going to make it, and there are good reasons for that. But if we're going to do that, then we have to acknowledge the fact that we're not making it easier for them. And we have to be honest about, okay, how do we solve this problem? And that goes to my point about integrity. Because I do think that this is where, if you take all four of these things, these are very high level, obviously, and I've been talking about a few very specific things. But in order to, what I'm trying to tell you is that all of these are actually hard questions to answer, and this is where I think technology comes in. Because if we know, if we're very serious about the questions that we're asking, and if we get to the right answer, well, technology can enable those answers. So with integrity, again, going back to the New York City example, if you're able to share all this data, this responsibility data, the background info data, with all of your compatriots, what if we put it online? What if we just said this is going to be available to the public? Or what if we said, you know what, we're also going to put our own performance data online? What if we said, hey, this is our actual workflow, and we're going to make that visible to you, so everyone, other than the evaluation process, that should be in a black box, but so everyone can see where it is in the workflow. Those kind of things, I think, will actually achieve everything we want to achieve while also maintaining integrity. Because we want to go faster, we want to make it easier, but sometimes if you make it faster and easier, you're opening up a can of worms, right? There are things that you might not expect, but that's where the modern technology comes in. And when you're doing it, and when you're implementing this solution or whatever process change that you're looking at, you have to keep in mind your values. Again, I think a lot of corporations think about this too, companies think about this too, but we have to think more broadly about what we're doing. And so we need to weave in equity into everything we do. We need to weave in responsibility and accountability into everything we do. And I would add modern, right? I put modern in for a reason, because that also entails change, right? It's like you got to keep up with it. I was at this amazing Code for America conference, and one of the speakers said, "Design for the future." Right? Change so that the future can change with you. How great is that? That's the kind of thing that we should be doing as government. And we can do it. These are not things that we can't do, right? I think Ty also mentioned that we got a law changed in New York around putting this stuff online. Well, what he didn't mention is that I also try to get a ton of other laws, try to get them changed too, to make things a little bit easier. No one ever wants to go on the record to repeal something, right? To say that things are going to get easier for vendors. Just not going to happen. And I failed miserably, but we tried, right? And so, and that sort of try and fail, that push towards what we think will work, I think that's what we're all here to do. And so I just really want to challenge you guys to think about that. I want to have that conversation with you. How do we change it at our department level? How do we change it citywide? How do we make this process work for us, as well as the vendors, but ultimately for our residents? Because that's what we're here to do. And in the context of technology, I think this is where we have to plug into the sector. And we have to be aware, but also careful, because technology, right? As I was saying, it's not the solution. But if we're smart, and if we're true, and if we have the will, technology enables the solution. Because you guys are the solution. We're going to come up with it together. All right, thank you very much.